I'm going to be doing a quick introduction to trauma analysis. This is what we'll be focusing on this week. I realized that the slides had not been published in Canvas, so I made those available. So we're going to talk generally about trauma analysis with this slide. I'm not going to do the whole slide set, so you will want to do the readings to supplement what this short recording is going to be on. And then we'll go on later in the week and do, we'll cover more specific information about types of trauma. Okay, so we are, as I said, talking about trauma analysis. Just a brief little intro when we're talking about trauma. We're talking about pathologies, so a specific type of pathology where we have an injury caused to living tissue by an outside force. So the outside force in question can be any number of things that you see listed here, everything from chopping down to chemical alteration of the bone. If you have something like lye or acid, whatever, it can cause trauma to bone as well. Okay, so we have been basically going through over the course of the semester steps that you would go through in doing your forensic analysis. So we talked about biological profile last, and we're going to be talking about the next step, which is determining trauma. So the next question after you do your biological profile is to look for evidence of trauma. If you do find evidence of trauma, analyzing that trauma to figure out if it could be related to the person's cause of death. Now, we haven't really talked about cause of death. We will get to that in just a minute. But before we do, a few questions to keep in mind are listed here. Things when you're doing your trauma analysis that you want to pay attention to. Is there trauma present that occurred at the time of death? That would be something called perimortem trauma, which we will talk about a little bit later. Can you figure out what force caused the trauma? How many wounds are present? If you have multiple sources of trauma, what is the sequence? Do you have some fractures that are overlying other fractures? Where are the wounds located? What can you figure out about the location of the wounds? For example, if someone was attacked using a knife or something like that, they're going to have sharp force wounds to potentially to their hands and forearms. Those would be defensive wounds. So looking at where the wounds are located is going to be an important part of this. Okay, so trauma can be important for determining both cause and manner of death. Cause and manner of death are two separate things. These have important differences, so we'll talk a little bit about cause of death first. So by law, cause of death is determined by a forensic pathologist or a medical doctor. So a forensic anthropologist does not have the legal authority to determine cause of death. Now, they can find evidence of it and they can bring it to the attention of the pathologist, but legally it's a medical doctor or a forensic pathologist who determines cause of death. So cause of death, the definition is here on the slide. We have physiological events leading to death, i.e. the total cessation of life processes. So examples of cause of death, types of causes of death that you might see, heart attack, stroke, exsanguination, meaning bleeding to death, electrocution, asphyxiation, drowning, all of those types of things. So what physiologically is happening to the individual that leads to their death? So you could also have, diseases of various kinds and that kind of stuff. Now, manner of death is a little bit different. Manner of death has only 5 legal categories. So any number of things can be determined to be cause of death. It's basically the sky's the limit, but we only have 5 categories for manner of death. So manner of death, as it says here, are the events or circumstances that led to death. So we're not talking about the physiological processes here, but we're talking about how the death occurred. So as it's listed here, natural, accidental, homicide, suicide, or undetermined. In the picture here, for example, the individual's cause of death would likely be a gunshot wound to the head, whereas the manner of death could technically be determined homicide, suicide, or maybe even an accidental. So in this case, the police would obviously be doing their own investigation, including eyewitness testimony, crime scene investigation, all of that kind of stuff. They'd probably be looking for gunpowder residue on the victim's hands, that kind of thing. Anything that might be suggestive of whether this is the result of homicide, suicide, or an accidental death. Okay, so trauma analysis looks for evidence related to both of these. So for cause of death, you would be looking at looking for the presence of life-threatening injuries, and then for manner of death, you would be looking for injuries suggestive of some kind of violent force. Okay, so trauma analysis in forensic anthropology focuses on bone and teeth. So this is kind of a recurring theme that we've talked about throughout the semester. It's important for a forensic anthropologist to know how soft tissue decomposes, for example. But as far as trauma analysis goes, the forensic anthropologist is going to be exclusively focusing on the bones and the teeth. The soft tissue damage, if there's hemorrhaging or bruising or cuts to the soft tissue, those are going to be falling under the purview of the forensic pathologist and not the anthropologist. So as we've talked about before, it's always really important to be aware of the limitations of your expertise as a forensic anthropologist. Okay, so we talked earlier in the semester about bone having a composite composition. The composite composition basically means that we have an organic and an inorganic component to bone. The inorganic component is primarily calcium salts, and the organic component is primarily collagen fibers. So the combination of substances there gives bone resistance to compression and bending. So it's a pretty strong and durable substance. It's flexible and it bends in response to force. So if you had something that didn't bend, if you were just looking at a substance that was made out of the mineral component, you would have the tendency to shatter. It would be a really brittle substance, and fractures would happen more easily. But with living bone, since it's flexible, it bends first, and then the fracture occurs after the bending. So it makes it a little bit stronger. Forces that can cause bone to break are listed here. So tension, meaning pulling, compression, meaning kind of squashing the bone like this, torsion, meaning twisting, bending as you see here, or shearing where you have displacement of the bone. And we have here listed some characteristics of forces that can affect how the bone fractures, including direction, speed, focus, and for speed, the dynamic versus static force, meaning is it a quick hit or is it the result of pressure, kind of evenly applied pressure over time? For focus, sharp force trauma would have a narrow focus and blunt force trauma would have a wider focus. So someone getting hit with a baseball bat, the focus is going to be different than someone getting hit with like an ice pick or something like that. How is the force being applied to the bone? Is it being applied over a wide area or a relatively smaller, narrow area? So we will be going through these different types of trauma later in a different lecture, but we have blunt force, which again has wide areas of impact, sharp force, meaning cutting weapons with a narrow focus if someone gets hit with an axe or a knife or something like that. And then projectile, which of course in most cases from a forensic standpoint is going to be gunshot wounds. Now, a key to trauma analysis is looking at when the trauma occurred. So are we looking at antemortem injuries? Are we looking at perimortem damage or postmortem? So antemortem means occurring before death. This would be injuries that the person sustained during their life that are unrelated to their cause of death. So 5 years ago, did they break their leg? You should be able to see evidence of a past break, but it'll be healed. Perimortem, meaning occurring at or around the time of death. So these are injuries that may or may not be related related to the cause and manner of death. If someone, for example, broke their leg the day before their death, and then they are going to have evidence of trauma that occurred around the time of death, but it's not playing a role in the cause or manner of death. So perimortem trauma is going to be really important in trauma analysis, but we have to keep in mind that just because we find evidence of perimortem trauma, it doesn't mean that that trauma is directly related to the cause and manner of death. Postmortem would be trauma to the bone occurring after the time of death. So we'll talk more about this later, but an example of this would be attempts to dispose of bodies by dismemberment. We talked about that case with Charles Atwood earlier in the semester, where he was dismembering his victims in an attempt to obscure his crimes. So that kind of damage to bone can potentially be really important in an investigation as well. So antemortem trauma, examples include healed injuries, injuries in the process of healing, etc. As far as forensic significance goes, those older injuries can be helpful with identification. Again, we already kind of went over an example of this. We talked about the Charles Atwood case where one of his victims was eventually identified through medical records involving old injuries. So one of his victims had been shot in the head with a shotgun in the past, and they were able to use her medical records to match and get a positive identification. The second item here, multiple healed or healing injuries can also indicate spousal or child abuse. So that is something that could be indicative of who perpetrated the crime. If there's a history of abuse, then the police are going to, of course, want to investigate who was inflicting that abuse on the victim. So identifying antemortem trauma, what you want to look for is bone reaction. What we see here in the slides are long bones with healed fractures. So these are obvious, like very obvious examples of healed fractures. These are very poorly healed fractures. This is what would happen if you had a fracture, a compound fracture that was not set properly. So that's obviously really dramatic. This is something that's a little less dramatic. We can see a line cutting across the distal end of the bone here, and that is evidence of a past fracture that did heal correctly, that was treated medically. So you're always going to be able to tell when you have major fractures like this, even if they're healed, there's usually going to be some kind of trace on the bone of that past fracture. Just real quick, I think we already talked about this earlier in the semester when we were talking about the biology of bone, but the healing process of bone is pretty simple. Initially, you have the fracture, and immediately a hematoma starts to form. We have a collection of blood here that rushes to the side of the fracture. You will have a soft callus begin to form from that point on, where you have cartilage beginning to grow, and then eventually that cartilage is going to start to ossify, and eventually you'll have complete bone remodeling. So even when the bone remodels, as you can see here, even though this is a kind of a drawing, not a real picture, you're going to have like a thickening at the location of the fracture. So it's pretty easy in most cases for you to be able to tell when you've had a fracture, especially if you're looking at a long bone. Okay, so how long does it take for a bone to show visible reaction to fracture? So if you do have an injury, how long does it take for bone to start to visibly remodel itself? Studies have shown that it takes about 1 to 2 weeks at a minimum for bone to start to show a reaction. So if you have a fracture that occurred a week before the person died or 5 days before the person died, there's probably not going to be any bony reaction. So you're still going to be in this stage where you just have the hematoma, or possibly you have some fibrocartilage that's formed. But you're not going to have the bony callus begin to form. You're not going to actually have bone material being laid down yet. So it takes about 1 to 2 weeks at minimum for bone to start to show this reaction. So again, you might have injuries that occurred a week before the person died, and basically they'll be indistinguishable from trauma that occurred around the time of death. So it's something you always want to make sure that you're looking for any evidence of healing to fractures when you're doing this kind of analysis. So here is an example of a rib fracture with short-term healing. So this is an antemortem an example of antemortem fracture to a rib bone, you can see here that we have a bony response that's happening, but it's not healed. So this bone was in the process of healing when the person died. Here we have some fully healed rib fractures. The arrows there are pointing to where the fractures are located. So again, you have this thickening to the area where the fracture took place. Perimortem trauma is, as it says here, the most imprecise of the three trauma types, but it is forensically very important. So these are going to be, again, the wounds that are inflicted around the time of death that may or may not be related to the cause and manner of death. As it says here, perimortem wounds are easier to identify in a fresh body than in a skeleton. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so looking for perimortem injury to bone, basically you have to keep in mind what we mentioned before, that bone has a flexible characteristic where it has the capacity to bend before it breaks. So basically what you can have is evidence of warping. If you look at a skull fracture, for example, the skull will have evidence of warping if you were to try to reconstruct the skull and fit the pieces back in to this wound here. If this was a perimortem fracture, these bones would all have bent a little bit before they broke. So if you tried to refit all of these pieces in, you would probably have pieces that don't fit completely because they've been warped. So you tend to see, as it says here, radiating fractures out from the site of impact. Basically, fresh bone doesn't fracture in the same way that dry bone does. Again, you might have pieces in a skull fracture, for example, here, where the pieces don't fit back together well, because again, you have warping before the actual fracture occurs. You can look for color. So if you're looking at perimortem injury, the fractured surface should be the same color as the surrounding bone. So if you have post-mortem damage, you might have a situation like this where you have discoloration to the outside of the bone and the inside of the bone, but then you have this relatively fresh looking surface here. So that would be a good example of perimortem fracturing. Or I'm sorry, post-mortem fracturing. This one down here would be an example of post-mortem fracturing. Other things that can damage skeletal material are listed below. So these would be examples of post-mortem damage. You could look for carnivore and rodent chewing. I have some slides a little bit later on that have examples of that. Trampling or crushing of bone, depending on where the body is found. We talked about the Atwood case where some of the body parts were found in landfills. Weathering due to erosion of water or wind, and then potential damage if enough care was not taken during the excavation and transport. Postmortem damage to bone could potentially be relevant to a forensic case. As I mentioned before, you can have cases where someone is trying to hide the body or obscure what happened to the body. So you can have burning, dismemberment. You can have chemical alterations that are going to affect the surface of bone, like lye or acid or something like that. Okay, so to summarize, distinguishing between antemortem, perimortem, and postmortem trauma can be tricky. The easiest of these to determine would be antemortem from perimortem because, again, antemortem trauma, the thing that you're looking for would be evidence of bone remodeling. So if you see any evidence of bone remodeling, it's a pretty simple determination. Perimortem and postmortem are a little bit more difficult, so you're just going to, be taking it on a case-by-case basis. So PMI means postmortem interval. So postmortem interval means how much time has passed before the person died. Determining postmortem interval from looking at postmortem trauma is not completely straightforward. So, like the second item here on the slide, how long does bone retain its flexibility? That is something to keep in mind if you are finding a set of remains in a dry climate, a dry and arid environment. The bone is probably going to dry out a lot quicker than it is if you're in like a humid kind of wet environment. So looking at flexibility of bone could be a little bit more difficult in that case. So I think that's a good place to stop. I'll do a couple more recordings like this for when we talk about specific types of trauma a little bit later.